What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the PFF NFL show, part 2 of our team needs series that we're doing here this week, establishing some pre-combine, pre-free agency team needs for every team in the NFL. On the last episode earlier this week, we went through all the AFC teams. Now we are going to do so for the NFC. We're going to give you guys a ton of information to sort of know these teams the best you can from a baseline perspective. We're going to give you how much effective cap space they have, talk about some potential free agents, but then also give you some potential free agent targets, some potential draft targets for them as we establish those team needs and have a good conversation here middle of February. Dalton, how you doing, man? You know what? I'm going to call you out a little bit here as we start this show. Buddy, it's past 10 a.m. on the East Coast, and you said that you're still kind of struggling to wake up a little bit here. I need you more up and at 'em than that, my friend. 10 a.m. We got to be, the juice has got to be flowing way earlier than 10 a.m. How did we get to this point? You stay up too late watching tape? What were you doing?
Now, listen, I got to be honest, I've never been able to function all that well, early in the morning. Some people are morning people and some people just aren't. And you're right, I do stay up way too late watching tape all the time. That's a habit. But yeah, it's just always been the way I've been. It's just, the earlier things are, the more time it takes to shake the cobwebs off. And I'm not even old yet, so that's going to be a concern as we get a little bit older here. But no, it's just never been my thing. Just not a morning person all the time. So, some days it just takes a little longer to get the cobwebs off.
You hide it very well. You do. Because at least even the energy in that response there, I could tell that you're at least there. Although I do think it's funny you say that you're not old yet, but you got old man tendencies. When the camera's not on, sometimes when you are either sitting down in a chair or getting up out of a chair, you give that little
Oh, it's tough.
Every time.
Listen, certain things always take effort. It's just it's tough to get it moving sometimes.
And getting out of a chair is one of those things that take effort. We're going to give you guys plenty of effort here in this show as we kind of go through every team. Let's start with a team that's a very passionate fan base here in the NFC North. I want to start with the Chicago Bears here as we begin this team needs exercise for all of the NFC teams, establishing some team needs here for them as we did in the previous podcast episode for the AFC. I'm going to give you guys the effective cap space. And once again, if you missed the last episode, if you're a fan of NFC teams and you didn't hear me before, we're taking this effective cap space number from Over the Cap, and it's a better way to look at how much potential cap space teams have to actually spend in free agency and bring back their own guys, because it accounts for the draft class that you have coming up. Again, like I said earlier, let's say a team has $20 million. I'm just using a round number. $20 million in cap space. Well, a good chunk of that, anywhere from like $6 to $8 million of it, has to go towards signing their draft class. That has to go into how much money you have to spend every single offseason to remain cap compliant. So then in reality, you don't have $20 million to spend bringing back your own guys and going out to get free agents. You really only have about 12 to 14. So by using effective cap space, we take that into account, and it's a better number to judge things off of. So for the Chicago Bears, they have a schedule. Now, obviously, things can change as we get closer to the league year. New league year, I should say. $58.3 million. That's the 7th most effective cap space in the NFL. A couple of big free agents for them. Keenan Allen is one of them, but then a lot of guys along the interior offensive line. Tevin Jenkins, Coleman Shelton, Matt Pryor, these guys who started for them along the interior offensive line. Darrell Taylor is also a free agent. So, Dalton, when you think about the Chicago Bears and sort of their situation here with that information, what are some initial team needs from you? And then give me a couple of guys, free agency in the draft, that you think would be good fits for them.
Well, I think you mentioned it with Ben Johnson coming in, and obviously from Detroit where the offensive line was such a big emphasis. That's what it's going to be. You mentioned the starting three on the interior. They're pretty set at tackle with Braxton Jones and Darnell Wright, two solid players there. But I think they're going to be fishing at the top of the market in this free agent class for interior offensive linemen. You could see them in on Trey Smith from Kansas City, the guard. I think you could see him in on Drew Dahlman, the center from Atlanta, who would fit really well in Ben Johnson's outside zone scheme in the run game. So I think at the top of the market, first and foremost for offensive linemen. And I think the other thing you could find in free agency or in the draft is some run-stopping defensive linemen, right? Obviously, the pass rush got a little better as the year went on. You got Montez Sweat off the edge. You're developing some younger kids, but they need to be able to stop the run as well. I think that's going to be a big emphasis for Ben Johnson and for Dennis Allen, is running the ball and stopping the run. I think you start finding some of those trench players in free agency. And then in the draft, I think it's going to be a focus also. They've been mocked with Will Campbell a lot at that 10th overall pick from LSU, possibly moving him inside to guard, or you've even mentioned at center. And then I think from there, once they get better in the trenches, then you start filling some things out. You mentioned Keenan Allen being a free agent. There's a lot of slot receivers in this draft. You could find somebody to play in there, maybe somebody that fits Ben Johnson's offense a little bit better. And then I think they're a team that's going to dip into this deep running back class too, because they didn't get a whole lot out of their backs last year on top of the offensive line. So to add some speed and even some power into that backfield would help a lot. I think a guy maybe like an Amarion Hampton in the second round might make a lot of sense for him, that workhorse back who you really don't want to tackle in the cold weather. But first and foremost, they have to fix the trenches on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, when I'm looking at the Chicago Bears and when I'm doing, sort of mock draft exercises for them, they have that extra second round pick. And, I'll go through a 3-round mock draft exercise, for example. And if I give them a running back, in the second round with one of those picks there, even in the third round, a lot of Bears fans, they don't like seeing it because they say, no, you got to invest way more in the trenches before you get to that point. Obviously, if I'm drafting a running back in the second or third round in a mock draft for Chicago, I figure they've probably brought in a handful of new bodies along the interior offensive line anyway. So you're probably attacking that position still with whatever you have at number 10. But I do think that Chicago could invest in a running back. I mean, again, I keep going back to this. I talked about it with Aaron Glenn becoming a head coach when we were talking about the New York Jets when we did the AFC episode on Monday. But Ben Johnson, I don't know if he'll be this exact way of thinking, but he knows how much Jahmyr Gibbs meant to that team and that offense and what he was able to do. They drafted Jahmyr Gibbs 12th overall. They traded up for him. So that was a premium pick to go get a player who meant a lot for them. So look, even though I think that a DJ Giddens, an RJ Harvey, a Brashard Smith, a Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, for example, these are all running backs that I think you can get a little bit later in the draft, maybe late third round, fourth round, something like that. I wouldn't take running back off the table for this team, but there's no doubt about it. I think you set it up correctly. They have to prioritize the interior offensive line first and foremost. So it'll be interesting to see if they can go get a guy like Trey Smith or somebody along the offensive line, a big hit in the free agency portion of things, and then probably another pick within the first 3 rounds along the interior offensive line as well. But I do think that is the top priority for them, along with edge rusher, right? I mean, they're a potential destination that we've heard for a Myles Garrett. So anytime you're contemplating making that big of a splash, obviously you could think about that as high as number 10 overall, a Mike Green, a James Pierce Jr. I think that those guys would make sense for Chicago if they figure things out along the interior offensive line in free agency. But that is step one. That's step one to me, making sure that they get that and then sort of being flexible with their other needs from that point forward. The Detroit Lions, let's stay along the Ben Johnson train here. $42.1 million in effective cap space. It's 10th most in the NFL. I think when people think about Detroit and how good that roster is, they probably think that, man, Detroit's probably around the cap floor, right? Well, no, not really. They've got a lot of money to spend. They've got some flexibility here. Kevin Zeitler, a guy who started for them along the interior offensive line, he's an upcoming free agent. Carlton Davis is as well, a guy who they brought in. I don't know if I quite want to call him like a mercenary, but it was hey, we're trading for this guy. We're bringing him in. We're seeing how it works out for a potential Super Bowl run last year. Obviously, they didn't make it, but it'll be interesting to see if he was part of their long-term plans beyond 2024. Levi Onwuzurike, Tim Patrick, Dan Skipper's a free agent too. Ifeatu Melifonwu, Marcus Davenport. These are a handful of names that are free agents for them. And so some depth players for this team. You're not really in danger of losing anybody who brings a ton of splash to the table, but I think interior offensive line is something that you got to note. And then obviously, depending on what you think of Terrion Arnold and Ennis Rakestraw Jr., the 2 corners that you drafted, that would probably talk about what the priority is to bring a guy like Carlton Davis back. Dalton, what do you think about their current situation?
Yeah, no, I think there's not a ton of spots, but especially the ones on defense are very important, right, when you talk about edge and cornerback. And you mentioned it with the Bears, but I think the Lions might be right near the top of that list when you think about possibilities with Myles Garrett as well, right? And if you could ever pair Hutchinson and Garrett together, I don't know how you block this team, but I think that's what you're talking about, is trying to balance this thing out on defense. We know they're going to have, even without Ben Johnson, they have so much talent on offense that they're going to have a top 5 offense. I think Kevin Zeitler would be worth re-signing with, as well as he played this past year, is one of his best seasons, if not his best in the NFL, even at his age. So I think that is a possibility. If they don't go and get Garrett, and that doesn't take obviously a ton of money to do, if you don't do it. Then I think you look at the cornerback market. I think somebody like DJ Reed on the outside could really help him. I know, look, Terrion Arnold struggled a bit through his rookie year. Ennis Rakestraw, we just didn't see a whole lot. So I think you'd really be taking a gamble on giving him a starting role right away as opposed to maybe a rotational one. Somebody like DJ Reed, there's been some conversations that the Packers and Jair Alexander might split up. Maybe he stays in the division and goes to Detroit. And the other question is, you mentioned even Aaron Glenn being gone. How's this defense going to be run? Is it going to be run as aggressive as it was before? They're going to back off into a little more zone. So I think there is a little bit of ambiguity when it comes to just the scheme of this defense and how it's going to be run. But that's where I would focus is edge and cornerback, and maybe out front if you can re-sign Kevin Zeitler and you still have the offense set at all 11 spots.
Yeah, because the offensive line part of this is kind of interesting because Dan Skipper, a guy that we saw them, use in a variety of ways, somebody that they had as an eligible receiver throughout the season, right? Like he's a free agent. Do you have the capital? Do you have the long-term plans to bring him back? Kevin Zeitler, obviously getting up there in age, along with him being an unrestricted free agent. Frank Ragnow's had to battle through so many injuries over the last 4 to 5 years. It doesn't sound like he's thinking about retiring, but man, I mean, just he is somebody who's had to play through a lot of pain. You're not sure how much time he has left in the league, but he's still playing at a high level. So maybe you're good with him for the next couple of years. Anyways, Graham Glasgow as well, somebody who is above the age of 30. I believe he's 32, going to be 33 this upcoming season. So you think about that. They do have Christian Mahogany, who was able to play pretty well. I liked him as an identity fit. They drafted Giovanni Manu, who they want to be a developmental offensive lineman there. So I think they're okay along the interior offensive line. If they were to bring back Zeitler, for example, I don't think you have to make another splash or another big-time draft addition on interior offensive line, even with the age of that group kind of going up, because you've got a couple of guys that you feel good about there. Corner, it all depends on what you think of Terrion Arnold and Ennis Rakestraw Jr. I agree with you completely. Edge is that spot that I go to there for them in the first round. I feel like they should absolutely be hammering that. And if they're going to make a major splash anywhere on the roster, I feel like it would be edge, right? Is this a team that is any way, shape, or form going to be tied to Myles Garrett and the possibility of him joining the squad? Is this a Josh Sweat location? If Khalil Mack is going to leave the Los Angeles Chargers, do you think about him there? I know you got Chase Young on there as more of a guy that you sort of take a flyer on, see what he can become on the opposite side of Aiden Hutchinson. But I wonder if they feel good enough about their future investments and where they're at along the interior offensive line to say, no, a lot of that 42.1 effective cap space, we're going to make a big splash. And if they are, I feel like edge is the position to do it. You talked about Jair Alexander, so let's go to the Green Bay Packers next. $39 million in effective cap space, 11th most in the NFL, so they've got a little bit of flexibility there with them as well. Yeah, even though Jair Alexander is not a free agent, he is somebody who went through injury this past season. Brian Gutekunst they asked him about Jair Alexander, and he's like, look, he's a heck of a player when he's healthy, but it's frustrating for us. It's frustrating for him. And it might be a situation where they just go, hey, the best ability is availability, and Jair Alexander was not available for them last year, and he's gone through injury. So amongst what I think is a big cornerback need for this team as well, you could throw Jair Alexander and him potentially not being on the Green Bay Packers in 2025. Josh Myers, their interior offensive lineman, Eric Stokes, Tardarell Slayton, along the defensive line there. What are the primary team needs that you have for the Packers?
Yeah, I think there's some clear ones, and some of the important spots that it was for Detroit too. When you talk about off the edge, look, the Packers pass rush underwhelmed this year. Rashawn Gary has kind of regressed over the last year or two. Lucas Van Ness hasn't given them what they've wanted as a pass rusher out of a first round pick. So it's there. It's cornerback, especially if Alexander is going to be gone now. I think then you're really talking about a shortage of talent at corner. I think you mentioned Josh Myers being gone at center. If they need a center, whether it's through the draft or a veteran in free agency. And then, there's been talk too about their wide receiving core, and for as talented as it is as a group, there's nobody that really transcends, as far as a number one guy, right? So I think that might be more of a draft target because, I don't know if they would have gone after T. Higgins if he was a free agent, or if they may go after somebody like Chris Godwin, but it feels like they need that one guy who's a real matchup problem on the outside as well. So there's some very important spots that the Packers need to fill out, despite even being a playoff team the last 2 years. You look at some crucial spots that they need to catch up to the elite teams in the NFC.
Yeah, I wonder, because I agree with you with the wide receiver thought process. It's a little bit how we look at Carolina, right? Where Carolina's picking a little bit higher in the order. We go, okay, wide receivers a need for this team, but not just any wide receiver. And that's the thing with the Packers. It's kind of, it can sometimes be a little bit misleading if we just say, oh, wide receiver is a need, because wide receiver 2 is not, wide receiver 3 is not, wide receiver 4 is not. It's just wide receiver 1. And that's the same thing that we have with the Carolina Panthers. It's like, if you can go get a T. Higgins, if you can go trade for a Deebo Samuel or something like that, a DK Metcalf, one of these guys that you think could be a wide receiver 1 in this league, or, Carolina's sense, I don't know if, Green Bay's going to have the ability to do this. Maybe they will. But thinking about drafting a Tetsuo McMillan, or if you think that highly of a Luther Burden, like those are wide receiver 1 caliber players, but it's not just plug in any wide receiver, and I think that helps with Green Bay. And so that's why I wonder which way they're going to prioritize things, because it feels like it's easier to get a wide receiver in the pro market than it is a corner, right? You got some good. Well, you mentioned DJ Reed is becoming a free agent. That's good. Travarius Ward is looking to get out of San Francisco, so like he's somebody that you think of. But after that, Rasul Douglas, Carlton Davis. I mean, like these are good corners, but how much are they moving the needle for you? I wonder if they would rather try to go after a big splash player, like you mentioned, a Chris Godwin, a T. Higgins, maybe is somebody in the trade market if one of those receivers becomes available in the pro side of things. And then for the draft, when you're talking about first round, you go with one of those corners. You try to get one of those top tier corners that you have. And I wonder if they just try to prioritize it like that. So what do you think about that strategy? That's the way that I look at it, as it could best serve the Green Bay Packers this offseason.
No, I'm with you. I mean, beyond the top 2 guys of Higgins and Godwin, you mentioned it with the receivers, and it's not a whole lot that helps them. I think there's other spots, especially in the trenches. Off the edge, they can find, a productive player or two, or if they wanted to sign a veteran center, say like a Ryan Kelly from the Colts, that makes a lot of sense. But I'm with you. The more I look at this in the first round of this draft, I think they're going to go on the defensive side of the ball if they really want to make a big impact, on that side. I think somebody like Jahdae Barron would really fit as a talented player, man or zone. Jeff Hafley can do whatever he wants with him. I threw Donovan Ezaraku in there off the edge because Jeff Hafley was his head coach for a couple years there at Boston College, or maybe a connection there, and they feel like he gives them something off the edge. And then a couple of guys you could target later, like a center like Jarrett Wilson, who could immediately start for them, I think. And then Jaden Higgins, I know he's not a number 1 receiver, but if there's something this Packers wide receiving core needs to do, regardless of who is there, they need to do better this year. They need to catch the darn ball, because they had the worst drop rate in the league by far, and Higgins doesn't drop anything. He's that big possession receiver that can at least move the chains for you. So if they're not going to go top of market, and we know they haven't taken a first-round receiver in forever, what is it, since 2002, I think it is, then if they're going to look at mid-round options, I think Jaden Higgins is someone who could fit their offense and give them a little bit different dimension and just be a reliable chain mover who can catch the football, because that was really the issue for the Packers this season.
Minnesota Vikings, they have $54 million in effective cap space. That is 6th most in the NFL. So they have a lot of flexibility here, but they're about to have some holes on their roster with some unrestricted free agents, specifically at corner and safety. Sam Darnold, obviously a free agent here, and there's a big conversation of what you do with Sam Darnold. It feels like they are going to move on and allow the J.J. McCarthy era to begin. But then we get to Byron Murphy, Cam Bynum, Stephon Gilmore, Shaq Griffin. All of those guys in the secondary are unrestricted free agents. And so you sort of got to make a decision on what you want the future of your defensive back room to be, because you got a lot of flexibility there. But you also got guys like Cam Robinson along the offensive line, Aaron Jones, Dalton Reisner, Patrick Jones II. Like, there's a handful of pending free agents here for this Vikings team that, okay, maybe not like the top tier star type of players, but definitely guys that make up the identity of this team on both sides of the ball and how they were able to have so much success this past year. What's some team needs for the Minnesota Vikings here as we talk about them before free agency, Dalton?
So I think the first place I would be looking at, and I know Brian Flores wants to keep this defense performing at the level it did last year, but if you're going to start J.J. McCarthy, then you're going to need to support him, right? And I think those questions on the offensive line, especially at the 2 guard spots, are that's a big thing. You want to protect a young quarterback, and you want to run the football well. And I also think they're another team that I think they're going to attack running back in this draft. You mentioned Aaron Jones as a free agent there. I think it's a deep running back class where they could really reset at that position. And not having to pay a veteran, then you're talking about, okay, that's another spot we're not using a lot of dollars where a lot of teams don't, unless you have an elite guy like a Derrick Henry or a Saquon Barkley, right? But I think guard, I think running back, interior pass rush, they had a really good productive pass rush off the edge, Andrew Van Ginkel, Jonathan Grenard, but one of the least productive interior pass rushers. So I think that could be something they look into to find an interior rusher that can balance out the defensive line. And then you mentioned the secondary. They got to fill this thing out. Brian Flores takes a lot of pride in his secondary. Ideally, he wants to play a lot of man coverage, got away from it a little bit this year, went with more of a zone blitz kind of tendency to cover up what was really a defense playing above its talent level, especially on the back end. I think to add some talent at corner and at safety, like you mentioned, but I think at corner, find some man-to-man corners that Brian Flores has always used throughout his time as a defensive coordinator. I think that could really fill out their defense. But I would focus first on the offensive side and supporting J.J. McCarthy in what essentially is going to be his rookie year.
When it comes to who might they draft in the first round, they're going to have to really love the player. With whoever is on the board at number 24. Because the fact of the matter is, because of the trade up last year to go up and get Dallas Turner, the Vikings have just 4 draft picks right now. They've got the first round pick at number 24. Then they don't pick until 97 as a compensatory pick in the back part of the third round. And then they don't pick until the 5th round. They have Cleveland's pick 140, and then the 5th round again, their own 161. So they don't even have their own 6th and 7th round pick. So this is a team that you really don't want to have a draft haul of just 4 players. You want more than that. You want to have more darts to throw at the dartboard, as the saying goes. And, I like the ideas that you have and the players that you have there for them to target. Caleb Johnson's funny to me because I feel like at his best, he's like prime Dalvin, right? I mean, like when you see him as a one-cut back behind different zone blocking schemes, and it's just how athletic this dude is and how he can put his foot in the ground and just go a mile. I felt like the Dalvin Cook and Caleb Johnson parallels could be there for their styles. And so if they were able to get Caleb Johnson, I think that would be quite the pairing. I like Savon Ravel, right, from East Carolina. I think that he is the type of player that, like you mentioned, Brian Flores would absolutely love. It's tough to project exactly who they would take, especially in a first round, because, like I said, they have to love this player. And so if they go through free agency and they've got a couple of whiffs, like let's just say like they didn't get the impact player that they wanted at one of those positions along the offensive line, at the running back position, whatever, then we will better be able to project, okay, do we think they're going to stay at 24, or is there just not going to be a player who's worth it? This is absolutely a team that's going to trade out of the first round type of a thing. So something to monitor for the Minnesota Vikings. Moving on to the NFC South. Let's talk about the Atlanta Falcons first. 15.3 million over the cap in effective cap space. So they are in the red there with total cap space here are the Atlanta Falcons. So they're going to have to do some things to make sure that they are cap compliant before we even start talking about free agents. But teams, they're able to restructure some contracts and get some money up front and move some money around. So I believe that they'll be able to get cap compliant and probably have a little bit left over to go see if they can make a couple additions in free agency. Guys who they have who are pending free agents: Justin Simmons, the safety, D. Alford, and Mike Hughes from the cornerback spots, and then Matthew Judon. It was a big addition for them and sort of their splash pass rusher addition that, when you looked at the team for most of the season, it still was not good enough. So I'm curious if you're bringing Matt Judon back with a lot of the guys that you drafted last year with Brandon Dorless and Braylon Trice and Ruka Rororo, those dudes along the interior defensive line, Some team needs here for Atlanta, given the fact that probably don't have a ton to play with when it comes to cap space in the pro market, but they do have a mid-first round pick there. So what do you think about Atlanta?
The first thing that jumps out to me more than anything is their pass rush, right? They were a bottom 3 pass rush team in the NFL by pretty much any metric, and if you're going to make the playoffs and go deep into the postseason, you have to be able to disrupt good quarterbacks, right? We even saw that in the NFC, or in the Super Bowl, I should say, with the Eagles getting pressure all over Mahomes and rolling in that Super Bowl. If you don't get pressure, you're going to have issues, right? They have holes in the secondary too at corner. They need another corner across from A.J. Terrell. Justin Simmons was, he's a free agent agent at safety. You have Jesse Bates there. That, to me, might be a position you attack in the draft, but I think it has to be all about this defensive line and finding anything off the edge, especially. You mentioned Braylon Trice coming back. That's going to be probably a good rotational player in what's really his first year after tearing his ACL and not playing at all last year, but they're not going to be able to get at the top of the market, right? I think this is the one-off season now where the Kirk Cousins contract really hurts him, all right? He's not going to start next year, and you're getting nothing out of him, but he's got a massive cap hit anyway, unless you can find a way to trade him, and even then, there's still something to it. So that's really holding him up in this year of free agency, but I think you're talking about defensive line, and then, to me, that you have a crucial thing in that center position with Drew Dalman being a free agent. Who knows if they're going to get outbid by another team? You know, I mentioned the Bears earlier as a possible fit. You're also looking at possibly, with such a great offensive line, now one of those 5 pieces gone from it, needing a new starting center at a time when there's not really any in free agency that wow you other than Dalman, and it's not a very good center class this year in the draft, so they're really going to have to find some options there unless they can find enough money to re-sign Dalman. But for me, the focus number one is this defensive line and finding any sort of pass rush.
I would agree. I'm looking up Kirk Cousins' contract right now. If they post-June 1 trade him, they save $27 million. If they pre-June 1 trade him, they save like $2.5 million. So don't really do too much, but at least you get him off the books. Problem is, nobody's going to trade for Kirk Cousins, right? Nobody's going to trade for Kirk Cousins at that point. So you're basically, maybe it's a salary dump trade, but then you'd have to give draft picks back, and you don't want to do that if you're Atlanta. I think prioritizing the defensive line is really smart for this team. It's not going to be a big splash for them in the pro market, but emphasizing that in the first round, and just really with a lot of their priority picks, whether you want to call a top 50 or a top 100 priority picks as well. Certainly the secondary needs to get a lot better, but it feels like it's again about a 1 year away from this defense really having all of the pieces that they want to here. I love the shout outs with some of those guys that they could take a chance on in the secondary a little bit later in the draft. Kevin Winston Jr., who was a projected potential first round pick before he gets hurt this past year. He's a little bit raw in how he approaches the game. He needs a little bit more experience, but incredibly athletic. So a guy that, man, if he's available in the third round, just because he didn't play a lot this year and his tape's still inconsistent from the year before, you take a chance on that. You don't have to re-sign Justin Simmons, and you get a guy to play next to Jesse Bates. Noel Williams, I love that shout out as well. One of the better corners that we saw at the Shrine Bowl this past year, a couple weeks ago. And, Kobe Bryant, you can throw into that list as well. And there's a lot of corners I think you could choose from. You don't have to draft one at 15. I think you're right, prioritizing the pass rushers there for them. The Carolina Panthers, touched on them a little bit a few minutes ago, but $12.8 million in effective cap space, 19th most in the NFL. So they got a little bit to work with. Xavier Woods, who I saw played 100% of their defensive snaps this year. So losing him, obviously, you are losing a starter and you got to replace him. He was one of the very few players that I saw have 100% of the snaps this season. So he's a free agent. Mike Jackson, their corner in the secondary, is as well. Brady Christensen, their versatile interior offensive lineman. Shaq Thompson, franchise legend, but you're just not sure if you're bringing him back at this point, suffering the injuries that he had and with him being as old as he is. And then David Moore at wide receiver is another notable free agent that I had written down for this team. Team needs for Carolina. Picking in the top 10, picking at number 8. Got a little bit of cash to spend, but what do you think about this team and where their team needs are right now?
Look, obviously you want to surround Bryce Young with as much as possible, but the team needs for the Panthers are defense, and more defense. It was the lowest graded defense in football last year. They just, at all 3 levels, honestly, for me with this defense, if your name's not Derek Brown or J.C. Horn, your job is not safe because they have to just overhaul everything. Ajiro Vero's got to find players who can sustain production in this unit, whether it's off the edge with the pass rush. They had by far the lowest run defense grade in football. Linebacker, you're losing even starting safeties like you mentioned. That would be the focus for me. It's just how in the world do we get this to be at least maybe an average defense from where they were last year, because Bryce Young started coming on and you started seeing the offense play well, and they put a ton of money in the offensive line, and that really worked for them in the first year of that project. But if you can't get stops and you're giving up, I believe it was 32 points a game this season, you're not going to get anywhere if you don't make stops. And as much as, obviously the focus for every other team is on quarterbacks and scoring a bunch of points, if that's a given that you're going to give up 30 every week, you're not going to win very many games. So I just think all around at all 3 levels of this defense, and hopefully Derek Brown gets healthy in time for the season too, you got to find players who are really foundational players. I think, to me, looking at younger bargains in free agency who could be helpful before maybe you find some foundational players in the draft, because they don't have a ton of cap space, like you mentioned before, because there's so much money in that offensive line. But I think about a guy like Baron Browning, who's still just, 26 years old, who could be a productive pass rusher for him. I think about a linebacker like Devin Bush from the Browns, who just had his highest graded season, filling in for Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, but he had his best season in the NFL. Maybe a value play there as a young player. A Julian Blackmon at safety is someone who could fit their defense. I think they're going to be looking in that second tier of free agents, probably going like Washington did last year with more of a quantity over quality approach, but they just need to find starting caliber players to get themselves off the mat.
I love those shout-outs, specifically Baron Browning and Julian Blackmon. If it doesn't take some guys who are going to break the bank for you, and you can bring them in and give you a little bit something more than you had last year, I think that those are really good targets for them. They've got 9 draft picks this year. They do still have a second-round pick despite it not being their own, but I would not be shocked if 7 out of those 9 are defensive players, right? Because, like you said, they just need new bodies everywhere on that defense to try something new. So I like that call out. The James Pierce Jr. one, in the top 8. Mike Green potentially as well. The Andrew Makuba one I think is fantastic if they cannot get a safety in free agency. And then, Jack Kaiser, love that as well, to give them a good athletic linebacker who had a ton of playing experience when he was at Notre Dame. So the only offensive player who I think could sway them from defense at number 8 overall is the guy that you mentioned, Tetairoa McMillan. If he falls and they think that this dude's a future all-pro type of a player, like AJ Green type of a player, then maybe you don't pass on him. But other than that, there's going to be a lot of defense for the Carolina Panthers. New Orleans Saints, everybody's favorite team to talk about when it comes to free agency time. They are $59 million in the red when it comes to effective cap space. Now, I talked to former PFF great Brad Spielberger about this in the New Orleans Saints, and I was like, what are the Saints doing? Are they just screwed? Like, this is like $60 million in the red is a daunting number. And Brad kind of said to me, he's like, look, they flirt with the line. There's no doubt about it. But a lot of the contracts that they do, they set up in a way to where right around this time of year, they will restructure them anyways. Like, it is set up to be like this. And so the Saints will be able to get cap compliant. They will be able to have even just a little bit to maybe spend in free agency. I know it looks like there's no chance that would even be possible right now, but Brad was he was explaining that the Saints sort of just operate this way. It's a way that you can operate. Obviously, not a lot of teams do it, but the Saints sort of have it built in that around this time of year, they will restructure a lot of their big contracts and they'll open up some money for. So it's not like the Saints are in jeopardy of not being cap compliant. They'll get there, but they won't have a ton to spend. Obviously, $60 million in the red is 32nd, dead last in the NFL at total flexible salary cap space as you're looking at it right now. And they got a handful of guys that I don't know if they're making like big decisions on, but certainly some identity players. And, with making so many changes the way that they have in the coaching staff, it makes sense that maybe more of these guys than not are not going to be on the team anymore. Will Harris, their safety, he's a free agent. Juwan Johnson, the tight end. Chase Young, Lucas Patrick, Marquez Valdez-Scantling, who was huge for them when Rashid Shaheed and Chris Olave were out. Paulson Adebo, Peyton Turner, Willie Gay, Landon Young. So, okay, it's not like the star names in New Orleans are free agents, but a lot of those guys who are rotational depth and just even contributing players for them might not be in New Orleans anymore. So when you look at this team, some team needs, what do you got?
Look, I think your problem is all the way around. Even though the star names aren't free agents, the star names on this team are getting older. And the problem with when you keep stalling and restructuring is you just push that clock back another year before a really hard reset. So I think, look, their entire defense needs to be reworked, right? Their run defense, I believe, was second worst, only ahead of Carolina. They didn't get much pass rush. Cam Jordan's getting older. Some of the younger guys they've drafted lately haven't come through. You even mentioned Peyton Turner as a former first-round pick who's now a free agent that they're probably letting go of. Brian Brzee has struggled in his first couple years on the inside. You traded Marshawn Lattimore at corner, and Paulson Adebo is a free agent now, so your opening day starters at corner from last year are also both gone. Look, they need defense. They need They need a little bit better on the offensive line. That left guard spot is open. Maybe they can keep Lucas Patrick for one more year. And who knows what Kellen Moore is looking for on his offense, right? Because I think they have a need for one more receiver to get him some yards after the catch and even more production at tight end. So there's a ton of needs on this team, right? There's a reason they won only 5 games last year, but I don't know where the resources are going to come from, because we heard this last year. The Saints are in cap hell, and they could only sign one player last year for more than $3 million a year, and that was Chase Young on a 1-year deal. So if that's all you can get is maybe one guy on decent money and the rest you're bargain shopping, it's going to be hard to improve your team in free agency, and then you really have to hit in the draft, right? And I think over the last few years, they haven't done all that well, especially with their earlier picks, and we know they have a tendency to get aggressive and trade up and kind of mortgage the future a little bit. But I think they really, if they're not going to do a hard reset, and it's going to be hard for them this year, then I don't know that you do anything but just get cap compliant and try to nail this draft.
It's funny. I thought this was going to be it. Right, we've talked about this for so long with New Orleans Saints. You and I have talked about it on this channel quite a bit. The Saints have been operating as if Drew Brees is still there, like since Drew Brees retired. And they're like going all in, and they're putting themselves in the red with the salary cap, and they're sort of mortgaging their future. And you look at the roster and you go, for what? Like, why are you doing this? Like, this team can't compete for a Super Bowl. And listening to Mickey Loomis this offseason, he kind of makes it seem like they still believe in this roster core, that they're going to continue to go all in. Obviously, they have Derek Carr as their quarterback, so I assume that as long as Derek Carr is there, they're going to have this mindset still. But I don't know if Mickey Loomis just thinks, if we start to rebuild, like, that's the end for me. I'm not going to be GM anymore, because he's been GM of the team for over 20 years. And so does he think, well, this is also, whatever this regime is, like, this is also all I have as a general manager. So when they turn the page from everybody that's on this roster, are they turning the page from me as well? Because it's hard to look at this team and where they are with the salary cap. And not that I think the Saints can't be better next season, but how much better are you going to be? When are you just going to eat your vegetables, if you will? When are you going to let the bill come due and just, take it on the chin here with kicking the can down the road year after year after year? You can get cap compliant, but how much better are you actually going to get as a team? I think it's hilarious that you have all just the question marks for free agents to target, and I think that's the right way to go about it. Even though I think that they're going to get cap compliant, maybe they'll have a little bit here and there to spend. Who knows? There's not really a good way to find some realistic targets here. So first and foremost, I thought that this was going to be the time. You're moving on from Dennis Allen. You're moving on from, like, what was the Sean Payton era. I thought that this was going to be hey, we are going to hit the reset button. And it doesn't feel like they're doing that yet. So they've just got to nail the draft. There's no other way about it. Corner potentially on the board for them at number 9. It's hard for me, honestly, though, Dalton, to not say offensive line or defensive line. Getting a Will Campbell, an Armand Membu, maybe a Kelvin Banks, however you look at those offensive linemen, to potentially play right tackle for you or play guard for you. On the defensive side of the ball, getting after the passer just was not good enough. So does a Mason Graham make it to you? Are you interested in a Kenneth Grant, a Mike Green, a James Pierce Jr., somebody like that? Like, I think it has to be offensive or defensive line because of how inept those two positions were, and how there's just not much in the farm system, right? There's not really anybody you can look at and be like, oh yeah, they're coming up, just wait until they break out. There's not a lot of that there on their roster for either offensive and defensive line positions, especially with the free agents that they have there. Moving on to the last team that we have in the NFC South, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Bucks are right at the cap floor. They're in the red, $1.7 million in terms of effective cap space, but that's something that Mike Greenberg and the rest of that staff there on the front office can really navigate, as Greenberg's been pretty good at setting up their cap for a long time. Free agents, Ben Bredesen, who was their starting offensive guard this year, he is an unrestricted free agent. Levante David is as well. David could potentially retire. I haven't really heard that he will, it feels like. I mean, he was still playing at a pretty high level last year, so unless he thinks that he's going to drop off next year, doesn't want to do that. I do kind of expect him to be back. I don't think he's going to play anywhere else in the NFL. I think he's going to go wire to wire in his career in Tampa Bay. Chris Godwin's the big one for them coming off of that knee injury. What does Chris Godwin look like? What kind of market does he have? And does he come back to Tampa Bay? But then you got a couple of other players. KJ Brady, who had to start at linebacker for them. Anthony Nelson and Joe Tryon-Shoyinka at edge. Probably not bringing either of those guys back. Sterling Shepard at wide receiver, a guy who had a good rapport with Baker Mayfield. He's also an unrestricted free agent. So what do you think about the Buccaneers? What's the team needs and some targets for him?
I mean, I think the first question that's going to be asked is about the two guys you mentioned, Chris Godwin and Lavonte David, right? Two mainstays down there. You mentioned if David doesn't retire, then he's probably going to come back on another one-year deal like he's been doing, the past 3 or 4 years. And you keep telling me they're going to find a way to keep Chris Godwin, which would be big for them. And it would be big for them to open up, especially in the draft at attacking other needs instead of receiver, right? But I think about edge defender, where Yaya Diaby's really become the feature guy there, but I wouldn't say they have any of the elite edge defenders in the league, right? They could use that one big-time pass rusher, so maybe, just maybe, Todd Bowles won't blitz so much like he wants to. And then I think some depth in the secondary too, right? I think it's safety. Jordan Whitehead didn't have a great year. Antoine Winfield was hurt last year, but we know he's an elite player. I think maybe somebody more like a true free safety, right? I think about in free agency, somebody like Andre Sisco from Jacksonville, which would only add to that rivalry now, or a Xavier Watts from Notre Dame in the second round would be a logical target for me. That left guard spot, like you mentioned, I think in one of your mocks you had Gray Zabel from North Dakota State going there and playing guard, and I think especially at linebacker, that's something that has to be attacked. Even if you keep Lavonte David, KJ Britt, somebody I kind of believe was going to be a starting caliber player coming into this past year, but just struggles in coverage. I think a linebacker that can cover and at least rotate in, maybe if you still play Britt on early downs and then somebody else on later downs, but coverage over the middle of the field was a huge problem this season, I thought, between their linebackers and the safety. So I think that's going to be a focus for the defense alongside the edge defenders.
Edge is, I think, the biggest need for them, right? If they have an opportunity to take a difference-making edge rusher there at the back end of the top 20, I think that they do so. But corner is also huge for them. After moving on from Carlton Davis, Jamel Dean struggled when he struggled to stay healthy, and even when he was out there, it's okay, but he's more of a CB2 than a CB1 type of a player. In that game against the Washington Commanders, they really struggled to cover, and it ended up being their demise. So I think corner, edge rusher, those are the big needs for this team. Certainly you could use another starter along the offensive line, but to me, that's where Tampa is going to look. And I don't think they're going to have a ton of money to play with for a big splash signing. I think that once they get cap compliant, they are much more concerned with simply bringing back Lavonte David and Chris Godwin. And so they will move money around to make those two things happen if they are possible. But don't expect this team to go out and sign a ton of free agents. I think that their focus is really more towards the draft. All right, before we move on to the next division, got to talk to you about our friends over at Cherry Bundy, the performance drink that is fueling the Healthlete revolution. Cherry Bundy is fantastic. Whether you are somebody who likes getting a light jog around the neighborhood a couple of times a week, just like getting your steps in, or you're training hard, you're training for a marathon, you're doing CrossFit every single day, you're lifting heavy weights, whatever it is, Cherry Bundy's got some great products for you. It's natural products, natural ingredients, which means there's no added sugar to it. The tart cherries that they are made with, highest antioxidant fruit or vegetable in the world, so you get that increased recovery, reducing of soreness, help support your immunity as well, and it's got that naturally occurring melatonin to help improve sleep. It's used by the very best. Nearly 500 collegiate and professional sports teams use Cherry Bundy. Every single NFL team, all the teams that played overseas, playing in Europe, playing in Brazil this past season in the NFL, they had Cherry Bundy with them to help them recover and help them perform their best. Products are available at Amazon, also retailers nationwide, Publix, Kroger, things like that. So check out those local retailers. But if you can't find anything there, you can go over to cherrybundy.com and get 20% off if you use the promo code PFF20. So you can check out all of their products. Some of it is based on really helping you with recovery. Some of it is based on helping you sleep a little bit better. Some of it can give you a little bit more energy. So whatever you are looking for to really help out that active lifestyle that you live, check it out, cherrybundy.com. They've got some fantastic products. Moving on to the NFC East, Dallas Cowboys. Let's start with Dallas here. 80.7 million would be a lot. 8.7 million in the red there. 26th most in the NFL. So obviously they need to do some work to get cap compliant before the new league year. Free agents coming up. Eric Kendricks, who was a starting linebacker for them. Jordan Lewis, Osa Odigizua. The legend, Zach Martin, also a free agent. Carl Lawson, Brandon Cooks, their starting running back last year. Rico Dowdle. All these guys are free agents for them in a couple of weeks when the new league year opens up. What do we think about Dallas' situation? Some team needs for him here, Dalton.
I think while another receiver is a priority, I don't think it's the first priority. What you have to add to this team is balance, right? And we know, look, when Dak Prescott's healthy and CeeDee Lamb is healthy, we know they can throw the football, and we know on defense they can stop the pass, right? They got a really good pass rush still. They've got talent in the secondary. They have to run and stop the run. I think that's going to be the theme of this whole offseason. The problem, like you mentioned, is the lack of salary cap space to go and get impact guys in free agency. So the first thing I think I would do is thinking about value guys that could help you in that spot, right? Maybe you re-sign Rico Dowdle. I might think about drafting another running back, whether it's in the first round or otherwise, because he's more of a complimentary guy. But think about a guy like Matt Pryor, who started at right guard for the Bears last season. I think they could plug and play and start him. He's even got experience at tackle. He could really do a lot of different things for you up front. A linebacker, maybe a run-stopping linebacker. They got Eric Kendricks last year on the cheap as a veteran guy. Maybe somebody like E.J. Speed from the Colts who could help them. But those are the types of guys I think you're looking at in free agency. Value picks who can help you run the ball and stop the run. Then I think in the draft, the same thing. I look at their needs. Running back, right tackle. I think you can get out of the Terrence Steele contract and maybe get a more productive right tackle, right? Right guard is another spot where we don't know what the future of Zach Martin looks like. I think the right side of that offensive line needs a lot of work. And then on defense, again, defensive tackle and linebackers. So the question is going to be early whether they go with a skill player, and everybody knows the big question with the Cowboys draft is if Ashton Jeanty is sitting there at number 12, is that the route they go and figure out the offensive line otherwise, right? Then, if he's either not or they elect to go away from that, I think about, okay, if by some miracle Tetero and McMillan were there, would they think about a receiver? Would they go? I think Armand Membu from Missouri would be a great fit on this team. If they get out of the Terrence Steele contract, I would really think about making Membu my starting right tackle. Early in the second round, Tyleik Williams or another run stopper. We've talked a lot about how there's so many run-stopping defensive linemen that could help a team like the Dallas Cowboys. And then they get linebacker, and I think it sucked to see DeMarvion Overshown get injured late last year, and it looks like he could miss a good chunk, if not all of 2025. But say somebody like Demetrius Knight from South Carolina, a really athletic player, can play the run really well, gets to the football as fast as anybody in this draft, right, and can cover pretty well too. But I think that's the entire overarching theme, is adding balance to this team on both sides of the ball, running and stopping the run.
Yeah, I love the names that you brought up there. This is also a team that has 10 draft picks right now. They got a first-round pick, second, third, no fourth-round pick, but then they have 4 fifth-round picks, 3 compensatory picks there, 2 sixth-round picks, and then they have Kansas City's 249 pick there at the back end of the 7th round. So this is a team where I don't know how aggressive they'll be to move at number 12, but like trading up from the 2nd round, trading up from the 3rd round, packaging a handful of those day 3 selections to be able to do that. Look for Dallas to sort of be aggressive in that sense. And I like all the players that you brought to the table. I think that all of those names make a ton of sense for them. New York Giants is the next team here. They've got 31.7 in effective cap space. It's 15th most in the NFL. So they got a little bit to work with here, especially because they don't really have any pending free agents that are going to break the bank that we know that they're going to bring back. Greg Van Roten is a free agent. Jason Pinnock's a free agent. Darius Slayton, Adoree Jackson, Azeez Ojulari. So some guys that you could go, yeah, all right, we could bring them back, but it's not guys that are 100% like, man, you got to fork over a big chunk of change to be able to re-sign these guys. So Giants have a little bit of flexibility here. Obviously, they have the number 3 overall pick in the draft as well. Quarterback, we already know is a team need. Drew Lock is a free agent. They have already moved on from Daniel Jones. Tommy DeVito is technically a free agent, but he's an exclusive rights free agent, so it's pretty easy to keep him there. Quarterback's the big one, but what outside of quarterback here, Dalton?
I think the right side of the offensive line, especially, look at this point, there's not really much else you can do with Evan Neal at right tackle. I think right tackle is a massive need for this team, whether they attack it maybe somewhere in the middle rounds of the draft or they find even a stopgap in free agency, somebody like Morgan Moses from the Jets who's a relatively productive player. And I think even right next to that at right guard is something they could look at. Maybe they move Jermaine Illuminor back out to tackle, and then you go and pay for a big money guard. Maybe you get in on the Trey Smith market from Kansas City, right? I think the right side of that offensive line has to be a huge focus no matter who the quarterback is. You should be set with Andrew Thomas at left tackle. You paid John Runyon at left guard. You still have John Michael Schmitz at center, who does need to improve, but he's a young player. So the right side of the offensive line would be the first focus for me. And then I think the secondary. I think, you mentioned losing Jason Pinnock at safety. You need someone back there to go along with Tyler Nubin. And then you haven't really had anybody emerge as a number one type corner, right? I think Deonte Banks has been very up and down his first couple of seasons. Not a whole lot of cross from him. Andrew Phillips is really good in the slot, but you need those outside guys to be able to cover outside the numbers. So I think offensive line and secondary, before we get to the quarterback debates in the draft, would be the big areas of focus for me.
Yeah, I think the names that you brought up in free agency are really good targets for them for all of those regions. Trey Smith makes a big splash for them on the right side of the offensive line. Morgan Moses can at least stabilize the right side at right tackle. And then if you can get your hands on Justin Reed, man, he's been so productive and so solid for the Kansas City Chiefs over the last couple of years, and Steve Spagnuolo's defense. So love that move as well. When it comes to the players to target in the draft, I think the team needs to stay the same. There's no doubt about it. But for me, if I'm the New York Giants, the big board, depending on how you view the quarterbacks, right? The big board is basically Cam Ward, Shadur Sanders, Travis Hunter, trade down. Like, that's it for me. That is how I am operating this draft if I am the New York Giants. Either you have a quarterback need and you're going after one of those top guys there at number 3, or you're drafting Travis Hunter to be that double dipping. I'd start him at corner, but he starts immediately at outside corner for you. He'll give you some snaps at wide receiver as well. If not, you're trading down. You're trading down from number 3. You're getting some more draft capital. If you're thinking like, well, no, we're going to draft an offensive lineman in the first round, or we'll draft a corner that's a little bit later. Just trade down at that point. Don't force one at number 3. I think the Matthew Stafford rumors are very interesting for this team. If they have an opportunity to go get Matthew Stafford, I suppose they will, right? Whether or not you think the rest of the roster is ready for that or not, Joe Shane and Brian Dable's jobs quite literally depend on it. And so going to get a quarterback that can hit the ground running and gives you some wins next year, takes some pressure off of you, I think that they would be very in on that. Philadelphia Eagles are next, the reigning Super Bowl champs. They have $11.3 million in effective cap space to work with. Now, that's probably more than you would think, given how stacked that roster is. You think that they might be in the red here, but they're not. They've operated things pretty well. The problem is they got a lot of studs that are upcoming free agents, and they're not going to be able to bring back all of them. One, Zach Bond, who was one of the best defensive players in the NFL this past year, came over on a 1-year deal. He's a free agent. Josh Sweat and Milton Williams along the defensive line are as well. Brandon Graham's going to retire. Mekhi Becton's a free agent. He was a starter for them along the offensive line. Kenneth Gainwell, Fred Johnson, guys who were key sort of depth pieces for them. Philly's roster, one of the best in the NFL. I think that goes without saying with them winning the Super Bowl, especially in emphatic fashion the way that they did. But some team needs for them, especially looking at the guys that might be out via free agency.
Yeah, I think the number one thing that sticks out for me is at linebacker, where Zach Bond and Oren Burks are both free agents, and Nakobe Dean ended his year injured. So I think linebacker is an area of focus, and I think of all the guys that they're losing, I think Zach Bond is probably the one they lock in on the most, right? I know they're losing Josh Sweat and Milton Williams, but they've got depth at defensive tackle. They got some depth off the edge, and they can still look in the draft for that. It's a very deep defensive line class. I think that's something we got to think about. But Bond and maybe even Oren Burks would be the first priority there for me. And then, you start to think about, okay, Mekhi Becton at right guard, can we afford to keep him? Is someone else going to pay him like a plus starter at right guard? Is that something we have to look at in the draft? Also, I think free agency is going to be very internally focused for the Eagles. I don't know that there's going to be a lot of exterior additions. And honestly, like you mentioned with the roster, they don't need a ton of exterior veteran additions right outside of maybe a role player here and there. But I think Zach Bond would be the first guy that I look at that it comes to retaining. He was the highest graded linebacker in football this year, found his groove at that spot in his first year playing off the ball under Vic Fangio, who's a linebacker. We just know he's a linebacker genius at this point with all the guys he's worked on in his career. So I think internally is going to be the focus on the free agents. And then I think in the draft, look, we know the usual. They're going to draft well in the trenches because they always do. They find guys to develop, whether it's round 1 or round 7. So I think we look at the types of players they could be looking at. I think somebody like Tyler Booker, if he were to fall to them at 32, I don't know if he'll get that far, but if he did, he'd be a perfect replacement at right guard there for Becton. Yep. Somebody like Elijah Roberts from SMU really intrigues me off the edge. He's a great run defender, a good power edge rusher. And then I think, some more depth for the offense, and I know they just put up, 34 points in the Super Bowl, but there's always been a thought for me, I'm like, what if they added a third receiver? Just somebody either in the slot or somebody that on the outside that could move Devontae Smith into the slot, a third receiver. I know they traded for Jahan Dotson. Didn't do it. He had a touchdown. No, he didn't have a touchdown in the Super Bowl.
He almost had a touchdown. He almost had a touchdown.
Well, of course. Well, they had to stop at the 1 to get the tush push going. But a slot receiver you could add in like a Xavier Restrepo or even some depth behind Saquon Barkley. I believe Kenneth Gainwell is a free agent as well. Yes, he is. And you're talking about, look, Barkley carried a huge load for you this year, right? But wouldn't you like to get him a breather just once in a while and maybe find a good receiving back, say like a Brashard Smith, who could just give him some air a little bit, unless he's willing to play every snap again next year and set more records, which is certainly possible. But no, I think at this point you're looking at linebacker, right guard, and then just adding depth the rest of the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to find team needs for this team because I don't disagree with any of the logic that you said, but like you look at wide receiver, Jahan Dotson's still on the team. They drafted Johnny Wilson. They've got Anaya Smith as well. You talked about a receiving back. If Kenneth Gainwell leaves, they've got Will Shipley, who they were getting in the rotation there towards the end of the season. I think offensive line's the one where you go, okay, they could definitely use one. And I think that's where their mind will look when it comes to pick number 32. But Zach Bond, you might not be able to bring him back. You're hoping that Nakobe Dean, is able to bounce back after that injury. But you've also got Jeremiah Trotter Jr. Maybe you get to a point where Demetrius Knight from South Carolina or Jahad Campbell is there for you at number 32, and you think about that. But even on the defensive line, okay, you're losing Milton Williams, you're losing Josh Sweat. Nolan Smith took a step up this year. You have Jalix Hunt, you have Moro Ojomo, you have Bryce Huff as well. So it's so hard to look at the Eagles and say, yeah, these are the things that they could target. The fact of the matter is, the Eagles are going to draft best player available because they put themselves in that situation and the champs because of it. And yeah, that's where we're at with Philly. They're going to draft the best player that they possibly can anytime that they come on the clock this draft season. The Washington Commanders, $68.4 million in effective cap space after an incredible year. That's third most in the NFL. Now, the interesting part about this is they have a lot of players who were either sort of like one-year signings, guys that they brought in with Dan Quinn coming in last year, or players that are sort of on these expiring contracts that were identity players that I wonder if they're going to bring back some of those core players for them. Bobby Wagner is a big one for them for how well Bobby Wagner played, but he's, getting up there in age. Jeremy Chin, Benjamin St. Juste, and Noah Igbenogany at the cornerback spots. Zach Ertz, Dante Fowler Jr., receivers, Diami Brown, Olamide Zaccheaus, they're free agents. Cornelius Lucas, they're veteran along the offensive line. So they've got a lot of space to work with. I think they have a lot of flexibility. They've been a team that we've linked to with Myles Garrett coming over because they've got the cap space to be able to take that on. They were a rumored spot for Brandon Ayuk before he signed his contract with the San Francisco 49ers. But there's a lot of just like core depth players that they're going to have to make some decisions on and whether or not they are part of their long-term plans. What do you see for this team as their major team needs, knowing they've got a lot of guys that could be out of there that we saw on this team this past season that was so successful?
Yeah, I mean, it just shows you what Jaden Daniels did for this team this year, because when you have a team that's relatively weak or at least thin at offensive line, defensive line, receiver, and corner, those teams don't usually make the NFC title game, right? So they still have a lot of very important spots to fill out with premier talent. Like you mentioned, last year they didn't expect to get as far as they did, I'm sure, but filling it out with veteran one-year contracts was the way to go to at least, kind of like the approach I said Carolina should make earlier. Just get functional players in there and maybe a handful of them hit and play like starters, and you have massive improvement along with what you had at quarterback. The two guys on their free agent list that I would say, okay, come back as long as you want to come back, are Bobby Wagner and Zach Ertz. And I think especially Wagner, at his age, still one of the best linebackers in football. I don't think anybody, even at his age, still fills the run as well as he does. I think he could still be the captain and the centerpiece of their front seven for another year. So especially Wagner, if he wants to come back, you find a way to bring him back. But I think otherwise, they're in a position with their cap space and having an elite quarterback on a rookie contract to go and get younger foundational players, right? You're talking guys in their mid-20s, and there's not a ton of them in this free agent class, but I think about if Chris Godwin were to become available and he becomes the number 2 for Terry McLaurin. I think about Alaric Jackson, the left tackle from the Rams, right? Brandon Coleman was playing left tackle, but he's a movable piece with guard experience, or he could even flip over to the other side. I think about DJ Reed at corner, just to add something there, because they had among the lowest, I think they might have been the lowest graded group of corners in the league last year, or even look in the division for an edge player, somebody like Josh Sweat, or we've talked about Washington maybe being in that Myles Garrett sweepstakes, right? I think you have so many important pieces on this team that need to be filled in, right, with big-time players. I mean, you're talking about, again, offensive tackle, receiver, edge player, corner. These are some of the most important positions on a football team, right? And the fact that they got this far with those spots being this flawed now means they're in position to fill those things when they don't have to focus on a quarterback like they did last year.
It's going to be interesting to see. I'm a big Dan Quinn guy. I'm a big Dan Quinn guy when it comes to roster building and culture building. And so how much of this roster that they had so much, because I don't mean this as an insult, like surprise success with this past season, how much of these guys are they bringing back and saying, no, you played a pivotal part of what we were trying to do, and how much of it is, no, okay, that we knew that you were probably more of a short-term addition for us. I like a lot of this. Obviously, Chris Godwin's huge for this team. If they're able to get him, DJ Reed would be a massive upgrade at the cornerback spot. And Myles Garrett you should definitely be the priority team there if he becomes available, and if he truly becomes available. I know he said that he has demanded a trade, but, Cleveland has sort of said otherwise. So we'll see if he ends up getting moved. I think that he does. So that's the big splash that I think you're going after. But I love the Alec Iamater addition as well. Give you a big-bodied X in the draft, potentially a Trey Amos guy, depending on how much press man coverage you want to play. If you're going to run a little bit more cover 3, he's probably not the best guy for you. But I think that we can sort of get into the nitty-gritty of that when we sort of break down these prospects a little bit more. But Washington in for a very interesting offseason for sure. Moving on to the last division, the NFC West, and we're starting with the Arizona Cardinals. Cardinals have $65.9 million in effective cap space to spend. That is 4th most in the NFL. It's interesting looking at their upcoming free agents, because they're about to have so much flexibility along the defensive line. And I think when you thought of the Arizona Cardinals and some draft needs for them, some team needs, I think edge rusher and interior defensive line was already sort of top of mind, but LJ Collier, Roy Lopez, Baron Browning, Julian Okwara, Dennis Gardick, Jesse Luketa, Victor Tumakeje, like all of those dudes are pending free agents for them. And then you go to the offensive line as well, Evan Brown, Will Hernandez, Kelvin Beachum. Like, to me, it just feels as though it's going to be a heavy trench draft for the Arizona Cardinals. What do you think when it comes to their team needs?
No, I agree. I think free agency and in the draft, I think there's several guards. You mentioned both of their starting guards in Brown and Hernandez that could need to be replaced, right? Maybe they bring back an Evan Brown on a cheaper contract and he sticks around one more year, because there's going to be some percentage of those guys in the trenches that get retained. I don't know if they want to go with a completely fresh start into a year where they probably feel like they could get in wild card contention with a good offseason at the very least, right? It is a tough division, but the Cardinals, didn't they start, what was it, 6-3 they started, or 6-4?
Shoot, I think it was better than that, wasn't it? Hold on.
It may have been, and then they had a losing streak where everything just kind of fell apart on them, a 4 or 5 game losing streak down the stretch. But, I think you're right. Trenches are going to be a big focus. I think they're one of the teams with all the cap space that if they wanted to get in on a bigger name in free agency on the defensive line, a Josh Sweat or a Milton Williams especially, I think would fit perfectly in there. I mentioned those two guys as well because Jonathan Gannon's going to be at least somewhat familiar with them from his time in Philly, right? So you mentioned it. Offensive line, the guard spots I think are easier to fill in free agency than the tackle spots. I think when you get to the draft, then you start talking about, okay, more depth off of the edge, maybe a starting right tackle, maybe somebody like an Armand Membu or somebody else that'll flip over from left tackle to right tackle. I think you have a lot in the trenches that needs to be worked on. And then I think cornerback is another spot on the outside. Garrett Williams became one of the best players in the slot this season, but they need some help on the outside. I think another team that would fit with Jair Alexander really well, or maybe a Kendall Fuller who was just released from the Miami Dolphins. They got some key spots to fill, but this team I don't think is that far away from playoff contention. But you mentioned it, the trenches are going to be the main focus this offseason.
I would agree. I like the targets of Armand Membou, Derek Harmon. I think Kenneth Grant, you could throw him in there as well. I think he's a really good football player. I think when you talk about interior defensive linemen like a Derek Harmon or a Kenneth Grant, I think some Arizona Cardinals fans are more apathetic about that just because it's not a major difference maker. And unfortunately, I feel like they have a lot of holes along the defensive line. So when you look at that kind of addition, you go, okay, well, how much is this really moving the needle for us next year? I think you still need to try to make that addition if you think that's the best football player available there for you in the first round. This is a big year for Kyler Murray. I thought that this past year, Kyler was going to become the closest version to that MVP season that we have seen from him yet. He's dealt with some injury. Now he's fully healthy this past year. And it was a lot of inconsistencies from Kyler. And I'm not saying that you're about to move on from him. I still think he's a quarterback that you can win with in this league. But if he puts up another season in 2025 that's just a lot of highs, a lot of lows, a lot of, you sort of live with the good, live with the bad, then I think you think about Kyler Murray differently. And I don't think that – I think that there then is too much evidence to the contrary of thinking that he will consistently be an MVP caliber quarterback for you. And you would have to think he's just going to be sort of a roller coaster ride of a player. So this year, for as much as, they got major defensive line needs, to me, they also need to have players in place to allow Kyler to play as well as he possibly can, because if you don't get the answer that you want from him, then all of a sudden you maybe start thinking about other options, or maybe you are less all in on this Kyler Murray era. I haven't even looked up his contract, so I don't know. Maybe they're not even close from, moving on from him or anything like that. But to me, I think it's a huge Kyler year. So I think with a lot of money to spend in free agency, as much as they need help on the defensive side of the football, I'm going after interior offensive line. I'm improving that offensive line as best I can. I'm maybe going after, upgrading some passing weapons or running back depth or whatever it is. I know McBride and having Marvin Harrison Jr. and Michael Wilson, who I like, and James Conner is great, but you've got to make sure that there's no excuses there. Do you have Kyler Murray's contract up? Did you look at it? What's he at right now?
Yeah, essentially, the way it's structured is this is the make or break year. Like you mentioned, they can pretty easily get out of it next offseason. Even a post-June 1 cut saves them $42 million next offseason and creates about $11 million in dead money, but it would save them a ton of money. This offseason, you couldn't do anything about it, and you probably wouldn't anyway, like you mentioned. But the way this is structured, this is really the make or break year, because the 2026 offseason, they could really get out of it pretty easily and start setting themselves up maybe in next year's draft.
Los Angeles Rams, speaking of quarterbacks that might be on the move, there's rumors out there that Matthew Stafford could potentially be out with the Los Angeles Rams. I kind of think that would be crazy, but right now they're scheduled to have $34.7 million in effective cap space available. That is 14th most in the NFL. Outside of Matthew Stafford, some guys that are some potential, some upcoming free agents for them: Valeric Jackson, Demarcus Robinson, Christian Roseboom, Joe Noteboom, Akilah Weatherspoon, Bobby Brown III, he was a great run stuffer for them, Neville Gallimore as well. Jimmy Garoppolo happens to be an unrestricted free agent. Not that I think that that's going to be a major needle mover for them, but what do you think about the Los Angeles Rams? Obviously, they're looking to trade and move on from Cooper Kupp as well. We kind of heard that from them, and that was announced, a couple of weeks ago. So some potential team needs here for Los Angeles. What do we got?
So, the Stafford rumors throw a wrench in all of it, right? Because they already had needs at very important spots. You mentioned Alaric Jackson. They might have a hole at left tackle after Jackson just broke out with a big year in 2024, and now he's going to be in free agency and maybe one of the highest paid offensive linemen in free agency. You have a need at receiver if you're going to trade Cooper Kupp, because there's not a whole lot outside of Puka Nacua and maybe Demarcus Robinson. Then I think defensively, look, they rebuilt the defensive line last year, did an A-plus job with that, but they're a little thin at linebacker. Obviously, Omar Spates looks like a starter, after being an undrafted rookie this past season. And then on the outside at corner, look, I think at D-line and at safety, they really fixed this defense up this last offseason, I should say. But now linebacker and corner, they got to fill out those spots. And like I mentioned, left tackle and receiver, those are two pretty big spots on your offense. And now if you have a situation with Matthew Stafford, your questions are, what are you getting back for him? And what in the world is your plan at quarterback? I mean, I think you have to start thinking about that. Do they turn around? Is it a veteran? Is it Sam Darnold? Is that where we're going with this? Because he ran a similar system in Minnesota. Is it, finding a way to get draft ammo and move up in the draft? Because I don't think, you mentioned the Giants earlier, they're not giving up the third overall pick for Matt Stafford. That's not happening. I don't know if a team, just with Stafford's age alone, I don't know if they would give up a first-round pick for him, right? So, and then there's a matter of what destinations make sense for Stafford. I think it's throwing a wrench in their whole offseason, because now you go, okay, if they don't have Stafford, if they're getting younger, are they really planning to – obviously you plan to win. Everybody plans to win, but do we really think this team can be in championship contention with a quarterback other than Matthew Stafford next year or even for the next 2 years, right? So I think there's a lot of fog surrounding the Rams offseason now with these Stafford rumors in there, but certainly left tackle, receiver, and corner especially would get a lot of attention for me.
Yeah, obviously the Stafford trade wouldn't throw a wrench in their plans. It throws a wrench in our projection plans for what the Rams are. But clearly, if they're moving on from him, they're moving on from him because they've thought about this. This isn't just a rash decision that you kind of make overnight, moving on from a guy that won you a Super Bowl a couple of years ago. So especially if he's not retiring, he's going to continue to play. We will see. I like a lot of the names that you brought to the table there for the Los Angeles Rams, but there's no doubt at all. Depends on what happens with Stafford. San Francisco 49ers. $38.6 million in effective cap space is 12th most in the NFL this offseason. Free agents. Devondre Campbell, who will not be playing for the San Francisco 49ers moving forward, so we know that he is not coming back. But, on top of that, Aaron Banks, starting guard for them. Talanoa Hufanga, who's been in and out of the lineup, but, man, when he's in the lineup, he is very valuable for them. Charvarius Ward, who's been a starting corner for them, but for personal reasons, it kind of seems like his time in San Francisco is done, and he's going to move on elsewhere. Rock Ya-Sin, Isaac Yiadom, those guys in the secondary. Dre Greenlaw, also an unrestricted free agent, which sucks because I thought he was a great linebacker, certainly before he tore his Achilles in the Super Bowl the year before, and really just did not get to play much this season, rehabbing from that injury. Elijah Mitchell, their backup running back, is a free agent as well. What do you think about the 49ers and where they're at with their team needs?
Yeah, I think with all those guys and some of them very big names, I think they have to figure out which guys they want to keep first and foremost. Do we feel good enough about Dre Greenlaw's health to bring him back and stay next to Fred Warner? Do we feel good enough about Talanoa Hufanga to be the safety alongside Jair Brown and continuing to be that, right? He hasn't really been the same since tearing his ACL 2 seasons ago, right? So I think about who in that group are they going to be able to retain? And where's this, obviously, all the cap stuff goes into where's this Brock Purdy situation going and how much is he going to make over the next 4 or 5 years? And then beyond that, I think about the trenches, right? I think about their offensive line, something we've talked about for a long time. Aside from Trent Williams, who are the stars going to be on this offensive line? Now you've got your left guard, Aaron Banks, is a free agent. Is he another guy that's going to stay? They're another team I think about as a scheme fit. Maybe if you're going big at center, going and getting a guy like Drew Dahlman, who's a really good outside zone blocker. And then on the defensive line, stopping the run's been a problem, right? You have Nick Bosa. The base of your pass rush is going to be good. But I think about somebody like Poona Ford from the Chargers who could really help you on the inside. Even if they were to re-sign Javon Hargrave, that doesn't help the run defense at all. Hargrave's a great pass rusher, but he's not a very good run defender, hasn't been for years. So somebody like Poona Ford or Taylor Tart from the Chargers, we know it's a big-time run-defending defensive tackle class this year. I think they could get a lot of that, even 1 or 2 guys, multiple guys from this class. But I think about the trenches first and foremost when you talk about the overall improvement of the Niners. They need a better rest of the offensive line aside from Trent Williams. And even eventually, I think you saw Kelvin Banks there on the board for them. And I don't think there would be a more perfect fit in this draft than them taking Kelvin Banks at 11. Even if he plays on the right side first, or you've mentioned him as a guard first, I think he'd be a perfect successor to Trent Williams eventually when he retires. I think Williams is obviously better, and he's an all-timer, he's an all-time great athlete. But Banks, and the way he fits in to that outside zone scheme, having run it so much at Texas and being a solid pass protector, if he was on the board for me at 11 for the 49ers, I would sprint the card in. I think Kelvin Banks is the perfect player for them to take.
I think a couple other players, you mentioned Jahdae Barron. I think he's a perfect scheme fit for them as well. And what Robert Saleh wants to do in that secondary, I think he's a fantastic player. I just finished Jahdae Barron's scouting report. I will be shocked if he's not a top 10 player for me when my board is finalized. I love him that much. I think he's great. The other name that I'll throw out there, Walter Nolan from Ole Miss, is the other player who I think is sneaky for this team because of how good of a run defender he is on the interior, how athletic he is, how big and strong he is, and how there's still some pass rush juice for him to achieve at the NFL level. So I think they'd be interested in him in the first round as well. Seattle Seahawks, the last team that we're talking about here today, they are 16.7 million over the cap in effective cap space. That's 29th in the NFL. So not a lot of flexibility there. Laken Tomlinson, Jerron Reed, Josh Jobe, Ernest Jones, some key free agents for them here. What about the team needs for the Seattle Seahawks, Dalton? What do you got?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple others listed here, but here's how I would put this. Left guard, right guard, and center. That's where I'm at with this Seahawks team, because the entire collapse of their season came along with their interior pass protection. I know there's been rumors about Geno Smith and what they're going to do at quarterback, but I do not care who their quarterback is until they fix this inside three on the offensive line. And the problem is they don't have a ton of money. So I think with Clint Kubiak coming in, you find some scheme fits, right? I just mentioned Aaron Banks from San Francisco. Kubiak runs a similar system. That's a guy. Could he bring Lucas Patrick over with him from the Saints? Could he go get a Robert Jones from the Miami Dolphins? Again, a similar system under Mike McDaniel as it is to Clint Kubiak. Those are the types of players I'm targeting in free agency. Maybe they can keep Ernest Jones at linebacker. Did a pretty good job for him down the stretch, but that nothing to me matters unless they fix this offensive line. You've got Charles Cross at left tackle, Abraham Lucas when he's healthy at right tackle, but this inside three cannot be as bad as it was to finish the season. They've got Olu Oluwatimi, who might be an option at center. They drafted Christian Haynes last year, who actually I think could be a better scheme fit for Clint Kubiak than he was for Ryan Grubb. You could see Christian Haynes find a way to start next year, but whatever happens this offseason, they need to come out of it feeling good about this interior three, whether it's free agency, the draft, guys they retain, combination of all of it. That's been the big focus for me. So I pretty much centered all of their their off-season plans around that.
I think Haynes is a good player. I think he's going to be one of their starting interior offensive linemen going into next season. I think Aaron Banks is a good one. I'll throw James Daniels in there as well, who was playing well in the early parts of the season, albeit a very small sample size before he gets hurt for the Steelers. Lucas Patrick was he hasn't been a great player throughout his NFL career, but he was great this past season with the New Orleans Saints. So he is worth taking a stab at, if you will. So I like the names that they have there. Bringing back Ernest Jones, I do think makes sense for this team. And then focusing on the defensive side of the ball, making sure the offensive line is shored up the way that you need it to. But then in the back end of the top 20 at pick number 18, you could focus on a guy like a Shamar Stewart, maybe even a Mike Green, somebody along the interior defensive line. And Nick Scorton, I think, is somebody who also sort of fits the bill of what they like with their defensive linemen. I think that could make a ton of sense for them. I love that you're getting the Willie Lampkin shout out there to potentially play as a center for them. He's got to play center, right? I know he played guard for North Carolina. There's no way he's playing guard at the NFL level at 5'10", 270, but man, his tape is so much fun, and his grades are great because of it. We saw him stand out at the Senior Bowl, so measurables be damned. He was fantastic and a lot of fun, but I do agree with you. No matter what happens with the Seahawks this past offseason or this upcoming offseason, whether it's the DK Metcalf trade rumors, the Geno Smith trade rumors, you got to make the offensive line a lot better than it was the year before. And I know Mike McDonald and John Schneider know that. There we go. That's all of the teams in the NFC and now the entire NFL. We're giving you some preliminary team needs before we get to the combine, before we get to free agency. In the next couple of weeks, we'll get to answer a lot more questions about exactly what the draft targets will be for all 32 teams in the NFL. And then, of course, we will be pedal to the metal with the best draft coverage that you guys can find. We got one more episode coming for you this week here on the channel. I'm not going to spoil it because we actually have a couple of different options that we could go with. So I can't say exactly what it's going to be yet, but it's going to be very either free agent or draft focused. Very excited for it. We're going to get to all of those topics no matter what. But for Dalton Wasserman, for Trevor Sikkema, saying thank you so much for watching the PFF NFL show. Whatever the topic is, we'll see you guys next time.